Many of you have heard this claim before, that John's Logos theology only comes from Philo. It's only Greek philosophy. Like Frank Drebin said in The Naked Gun, oh, there's nothing to see over here in the early Jewish Targums, the early Jewish theology, right?
What is this word business? What do you mean the word? Where does this come from? Now, this Logos theology is all over the pagan world, all over the ancient world.
This is step one in the disinformation tactics. There is nothing, fireworks going off, but there's absolutely nothing to see here in the early Jewish translations, the Targums, right?
This is all Greek thinking. That's the Logos.
These authors who write about the Memra have absolutely nothing to say, right?
In the Targumim, the translators used the word Memra, and the Targumic usage is where we find the source of John's Logos, Dr. Arnold G. Fruchtenbaum.
Well, that is exactly the tactic that you are supposed to buy into. There is nothing to see here in the early Judaism, the sources of the Aramaic Targums regarding the Memra and how John would have applied it to his theology.
One thing, however, is plain. The Logos of Philo is not the Memra of the Targumim. For the expression Memra ultimately rests on theological, that of the Logos on philosophical grounds. Alfred Edersheim.
And you have probably even heard very confident anti-messianic rabbis, apostate professors, and TikTok scholars who prey on correcting others give this very same message regarding Philo.
And then the idea of Logos being used in the New Testament was taken from a Jew, very famous Jew, who lived at the time of Christianity.
And so John 1:1 is expressing Logos theology, which we find earlier in Philo of Alexandria, and then we find developing.
This is the word you will have heard of. You ever heard of the term Logos? Logos theology. Logos is very famous because it appears prominently in the first 18 verses of the book of John, which is called the prologue.
Step two in this disinformation tactic is to say that the prologue to the Gospel of John is just Hellenistic Judaism dressed up in some polytheistic pagan garb. And step three of the disinformation tactic is to excommunicate Philo himself. He's not a real Jew. He's just some Jew influenced by Greek living up there in Alexandria.
Most of you heard of a man named Philo who came from North Africa. He came from Alexandria. He was not an Orthodox Jew, but he was a Hellenistic Jew. That means his views were completely oriented in Greek philosophy, which is very alien to Judaism, okay?
After completing these three steps, you have successfully framed the narrative that you want to spin, okay? Because you don't want anybody going through this book. I mean, this sucker right here, this is deep stuff.
The Logos title is based on the Targumic Memra, and that in John's adaptation, the word means Yahweh the Son, the one who is with the Father and shares the divine name with him. John Ronning, Ph.D.
So what exactly are these data framers hiding? They're hiding the fact that this very early John Logos theology did not originate with Philo in Alexandria, but in the synagogues in Judea, in Babylonian, where these Targums, these Aramaic Targums, would have been read every Shabbat or Sabbath. Many people have never heard of the word Memra, my pastor included, which means word. It means word of the Lord, and it is used hundreds of times throughout the various Targum translations. And in this Targum specifically, it is there from the very beginning in chapter 1 of Genesis. This Memra, or word, is a divine personal creative agent who stands as God, is distinct from God, but yet one with God.
The first truth about the Memra is that it was sometimes distinct from God, but other times the same as God. Yochanan, John, the apostle, did the same thing. Dr. Arnold G. Fruchtenbaum.
This should sound very familiar to someone who has an ear to hear.
And they heard the voice of the Memra of the Lord that was walking in the garden. Genesis 3:8.
There's an unmistakable oneness between this Memra and God. Yet step 4 of the critics will be just to write this off as just some circumlocution. But you'll see if you do a deep dive in the Aramaic Targums, there's actually more to see if you have eyes to see.
The Memra of the Lord was revealed to Abraham in the plains of Mamre, and he lifted up his eyes and saw. Genesis 18, Targum Neofiti.
This idea was part of Judaism, and none of them had ever heard of it. This is God as man in the Old Testament, and he's referred to as the Word of the Lord.
The verb ethpel means this memra, or word, was revealed, it appeared. The word became visible to Abraham. This verb is the standard Targumic term for a visible theophany, a real appearance that can be seen with the eyes.
This is the backdrop for a lot of that language in the New Testament. Again, the word of the Lord in the Old Testament can be a visual appearance of God as a man.
Welcome to the introduction video of the Memra, the Word, the real background to John's theology. This goes back to the very heart of Judaism. You can trace evidence of it back to Qumran itself and into the 2nd century BC, before Philo. When many critics want to spin their theory of a late progressive development of John, in reality, the Memra, the divine word, originated very early in Judea when Philo was still suckling on a wet nurse. We are going to ask a very important question. What is, or rather, who is this Memra, this word of the Lord? Stick around. We're going to actually examine the evidence that other channels do not do with their data framing. They want to spin the narrative regarding John equals Philo, but you'll see if you examine the evidence, do a deep dive, that narrative actually falls apart. Let's start with some of the basics regarding the Babylonian exile.
After the Babylonian exile, most Jews no longer spoke Hebrew as their daily language. They spoke Aramaic, the language of the Persian Empire, the language Jesus himself spoke. When they went to synagogue on Sabbath, the Hebrew Torah was read, then immediately translated and explained verse by verse in, you guessed it, Aramaic. Those oral translations eventually got written down. These Aramaic translations are called the Targums.
What you will see in these Jewish Targums, if you investigate it, is something very interesting. What they do with the Memra, the word of the Lord, is very interesting, and it's done over 100 times. They take the instances where God is interacting with humanity and have it as the Memra, the word of the Lord. This is the one that was creating the world. This is the one that was walking in the garden with Adam. The Memra was. This Memra was the one that created them in the image of God. He created them male and female. And this Memra, the word of the Lord, was the one that was in the bush with Moses, speaking directly to Moses, was the Memra, the word of the Lord.
The opening words of Scripture declare that the Memra, the divine word, created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1, and formed man in his own image, Genesis 1:27. It was this same Memra who walked with Adam in the cool of the day in the garden, Genesis chapter 3:8, and who spoke to Moses from the midst of the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3.
So you can see very much that this Memra, this word of the Lord, wasn't just some impersonal use of a word. It was actually a personification, the very divine presence that was walking with Adam. It was in the presence of Abraham. It was the one that was redeeming Israel or Jacob, the one shepherding him. It was the one that was speaking, conversing with Moses out of the burning bush.
Genesis 17 presents the Memra in visible manifestation. He makes an everlasting covenant with Abraham and is addressed as both God and Redeemer. The very next chapter, Genesis 18, shows this same Memra clothed in the divine glory, bearing the name of God, speaking as God with the authority to forgive sins. Centuries later, in Genesis 48, Jacob blesses his sons and testifies that this same Memra, the shepherd and redeemer, has guided and redeemed him all his life.
This isn't some philosophy that Philo cooked up and then later John borrowed. It isn't some idea that was cooked up later in some council and then trickled down in some later progressive development that was later written by John. This was very early, very rich, deep Jewish theology that originated very early in Judea, and the disciples would have heard it every Shabbat out of the synagogues. And I'll go more into depth in this in upcoming videos regarding the timeline that I'm going to quickly show on the screen. And this is the real kicker. The kicker to this is that this theology and this understanding goes back, way back to the Qumran community themselves in the fragmentation of the Targums. Yes, it's found very early in the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. This is pre-Philo. This goes back to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. When John wrote these words, he's not trying to sneak in some Platonic Philo philosophy.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:1.
He is taking this very early Jewish Aramaic theology regarding the Memra, the one that was the very divine presence, the one that was walking with the fathers and redeeming, and the shepherd, and was able to forgive sins and invoke judgment. He was taking that and saying that this word has come to tabernacle with us, God with us.
And the Word became flesh, and did tabernacle among us. And we beheld his glory, glory as of an only begotten of a Father, full of grace and truth. John 1:14.
John's theology wasn't a late progressive development. It wasn't borrowing from Philo. It was at the very heart of early Judaism. We can see it in the Aramaic Targums. And intentionally, Eusebius even records that John intentionally, he was spreading his gospel very early, but he didn't write it down until later, and he applied a very early theology regarding the Memra. John's message was very intentional. He wanted to express to us that deep roots regarding this Memra, this word of the Lord, and this Memra that came to tabernacle among us has a name, and his name is Yeshua. Yahweh saves. Alright, this is supposed to be a brief introduction to the Aramaic term Memra. I hope you'll subscribe and stick around for the upcoming videos where we will look at more of the timeline regarding the Targums. And we'll pull out some examples of where they actually use the term Memra and do a deep dive study on that. And I did throw up a few scholarly resources, references, and we'll do a deep dive study into some of their opinions regarding the Memra. But for now, let's conclude with the fact that long before Philo and this idea that this pagan Greek influence came and imposed it on John, and John took it and adopted it, long before that was this use of the Aramaic term, the Memra, the word of the Lord, that was present way early in the Judean history, long before anybody in Judea heard of Philo of Alexandria.
See now that I in my Memra am he, and there is no other God besides me. Deuteronomy 32:39, Targum Neofiti.